Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to be sharing with you your 10-year anniversary of Bonus. And I said I'll talk a bit about the context of P2Ps. Now, if the first lesson, if you want to understand European policy, you have to tackle with a lot of acronyms. So P2P stands for public-to-public partnerships. What I will address today is understanding a bit in a historical context, the rationales of these partnerships in a bigger context of the European research area. And also to how we think about the impacts of these type of policies, and how we think about these impacts has changed quite a lot if you look over the whole history of framework programs. A big concept also in thinking about what do these instruments make sense is thinking about European added value. The concept, what does Europe add value to these instruments and collaborations has also changed quite a lot over time, and it has an impact also on these public-private partnerships. Now, traditional evaluations of research and innovation policy already is challenging. You know, we usually are asked to evaluate programs or institutes, and then you have a very neat set of projects and a program with a quite clear focus, and then already it's very difficult to evaluate that. I would like to say something about how even more challenges come into the play when we talk about these public-to-public partnerships. It makes it even more complex. I'll talk about the state of play of the evaluation and say something about the future of partnerships and instruments and their evaluation. Now, I said the ERA instruments, the ERA nets already started in FP6, so that was before a more thinking about joint programming of aligning national and EU research came to play. But this green paper in 2007 really started to develop the ideas of why Europe should, the member states together with the European Commission should really coordinate their policies. And I remember very well it was a during the Netherlands presidency in 2004. The Director General of DG RTD at that point was Mr. Mitsos, a Greek person, and he was very. There was a meeting of ERAP at the time. He was very almost frustrated and angry, and he said, "Well, you member states, you expect so much of us, the European Commission, in setting direction, in helping to set the agenda, to reform policy of the research area, but you know, we, the European Commission, only have 5% of the complete R&D funds in the public R&D funds in all of Europe. You, the member states, you, the regions, you have 95%. So don't just look at us. Please come to the party and help us align and help us coordinate, because you have the 95%. And in order to leverage what the European Commission can do, we need the member states just don't need to look at this framework program and the money that comes from there, but also start rethinking their national and their regional programs. And particularly with these societal challenges that go way beyond the national capacities of one region or one country. So it was then, and the discussion started that, you know, it shouldn't be the Commission doing Commission programs with their instruments, the countries doing their programs with their instruments. It should be really more aligned with each other. And define what are the societal challenges that we as Europe can cope with much better together. It changed the governance pattern of EU, because as the member states, they had their programs. No one was interfering, as it were, in how that was run, how it was managed, how it was evaluated. Every member state did their thing. The European Commission had their instruments. There were, of course, the program committees and so forth that were influencing them, but it was quite two very different worlds. And in the start of this thinking about public-to-public partnerships, the European Commission, but also the member states, wanted a much closer involvement of these national research funders, that they have a bigger say in where European research policy would go. So that meant also that the strategies need to be aligned across borders. And there was quite some debate about why are we doing this? And one of the bigger arguments always said, well, together we have more critical mass. And the scientist says, yeah, but who needs critical mass? We're not really competing with each other. It's fine as it is. But the other policy argument was, well, there's far too much fragmentation. There's all these little programs here in this country, in that country. We're all doing similar things. If we align that, we might have better agendas and therefore also higher quality research as a result. So that was sort of the big thinking, and that's only 10 years ago. So here we are, 2017. I think you are one of the good examples where what has happened as a result. Since this era thinking, the agenda setting function of research has really been more explicit. Before the Commission, the role was this European added value it went from the philosophy of subsidiarity. Everyone at the best level could do what they can best do. So we do projects when they are big scale, where it makes sense to do that together. But also, if you look at the framework programs and the instruments that are created, there's more and more ambition and a bigger role for doing things together, also doing things for the European Commission to not only do science projects, but seize opportunities to be leading industrial in the world, to be at the forefront of various science areas, domains, to be ahead of countries like US and so forth. So those sort of bigger ambitions to do things as Europe became. Well, it was clear on the agenda, and that meant that we have to have a sort of more common agenda in research programming. Of course, there was also a lot of criticism. It sounded for the science community very much as a sort of top-down, you tell us what to do, but it was more about also defining themes, particularly in the societal challenge areas, in the grand challenges, where research should help bring solutions. So this also changed the way that the research, actually doing research was governed, because before you had a program, say it was the European Commission or a member state who would set the scene, set the agenda, and then people could ask for grants. In this new thinking, is also a much more sort of supporting of self-governing coalitions, consortia, groups like Bonus, bringing together partners, stakeholders, funders, research communities to set the agenda themselves, to define what they want to do and how they want to do it. So the governance of research policy seems to be shifting, not just from the policymakers from their desks, but more to these consortia with a very complex set of stakeholders who jointly define what is going to be done. So you see that also within the European Commission that there is a policy formulating part of the Commission and more thematic directorates that are more executing policies that are set by multiple stakeholders. And also they're thinking of European added value change. Well, it's too small to read for you apparently, but we mapped out from FP1, that's very long ago, to FP8, Horizon 2020 didn't fit in the box, so we call it FP8 for the. So it thinking about what does the Commission bring to the party in research policy has really changed from, starting from, if it has to be big scale, we will be involved in the first framework program, to sort of uniform standards, and it shifted much more in FP6, FP7 to contribute to these societal challenges, but also restructuring the research landscape, restructuring the funding landscape, restructuring how policy is made, and the very last element of this European added value is something that came in much more strongly in Horizon 2020. It's also to jointly define how we are going to collaborate with what we call third countries, which are the countries outside Europe. There's a bigger action now in together, not as every country bilaterally, but together as European, to speak with one voice how we interact with the United States or with Latin America or with Asia. So the Europe and the European policy has become a much more influential factor in also how we deal with research and science in our member states and regions. If we think about then impact, this has also changed a lot in the last decade. If we were usually asked to do an evaluation of a program or a research program or a research institute, traditionally it would be a very sort of short-term looking back, and you have a bonus program and it's sort of 10 ways on going, and then you look back at the projects that have been launched in such a program. But typically, policymakers would ask us to look over, okay, what are the scientific impacts from projects A, B, C, D? We would like to, if it's more applied research, we want to know, have the patents been created? If it's even more industrially oriented, policymakers want to know, well, did it bring us any, economic impact? How many jobs are created? That's sort of a very sort of clear targets that they want to know. And usually it's done very quickly after a project or a program has ended. So you always have to say, well, this is very difficult because, impacts are very long-term. You cannot say that immediately, and the things like jobs and economic impact are very difficult to attribute to a particular science or a technology project. I said that the part of what European policy is trying to do is to organize this community formation and setting together networks and platforms and so forth. Well, how do you evaluate that? That is also quite something which if you look at the long term, is quite different than if you look immediately. Setting agendas, had that made an impact, and even coordinating the fabric of research and innovation in the landscape. If those are the goals, then you really have to look at it long term. We were quite lucky, some of my colleagues, to be asked by the European Commission to look at what is the really long-term impact of all these framework programs. And this was a really challenging job because, there's all this data from all these projects, but, what is really, if you look back as far as FP1 and the data range, scientific papers is one, and I said patents and jobs, but you cannot get them out of these data on projects. You cannot get them out of all these huge number of projects and publications that get out of it. So we also try to really get the story from different domains of science, because the impact is not the same for each domain. So the thing that brought us the most insight were a number of very deep case studies in a number of scientific areas. And then you saw that the impact mechanisms go much beyond this sort of publication or 3 jobs created there. We looked at the first one is a very fundamental quantum information processing and computing. The second one was brain research. The third one was stratospheric research, solar technology, photovoltaics, research for the automotive industry and manufacture in general. And then you saw that the long-term impacts, and we're talking now 1-2 decades, is quite different for each domain. But some of them were really discovery, and then you can look at indeed publications and so forth. It goes out to more knowledge outputs. Discipline development, even this quantum information processing was a completely new area where the domain had to be formed, and the framework programs really helped forming a new domain and also getting industry involved. That was quite new. But for instance, in the automotive industry, the disciplines were quite, were already there, engineering, IT, and so forth, and materials. The framework program didn't really do much for discipline development in that area. We looked at, types of impacts that, people told us about, that if they look back, were focusing on devices, but all of them said agenda setting was really important. We jointly set the agenda for the research program, and that was for the very fundamental research, but also in the automotive industry, for instance, where they had common issues. These were big companies competing with each other, but one of the common issues were things like emission, fuel, efficiency, those sort of things that also have a public good, because safety is about societal issues. That is where they jointly created an agenda, how we could reduce emissions, how we could increase safety. So that was very important for them. Again, this networking, promoting self-organization of stakeholder communities, influencing regulations and standards, particularly also in the industry, that was important. Coordinating, influencing on policy, for instance, the Stratosphere research, they really helped changing the protocols for a policy, strengthening networks. The list goes on, changing networks, levering funding for R&D, just making it more visible, and attracting more funding from the Commission, but also to the member states. Mobility, learning how to innovate in a different way, speeding up industry entry into new technologies, in manufacturing particularly that was more in the quantum, but in manufacturing, tackling these common problems and addressing across the board, addressing areas of socioeconomic importance. So, if you look at it in a very long term, impacts are so much more than just the publications that immediately come out of projects or the innovations that companies might get out of European research policies. But that also makes it very difficult to really attribute, well, what did this 1, 2, 3 European projects, what did this contribute to these changes? That's very difficult to quantify, and particularly if you have policymakers, and also in this case, well, how much jobs did we create in Europe? Sorry, you cannot say that, and it's there's too many other factors involved that influence that. So, but it does show that there are a lot of input mechanisms to be taking account of. So, research and innovation policy evaluation is difficult as it is. These public-private partnerships add even more complexity. We say that we want to align policy agendas, that we want to coordinate, that we want to pool resources, but what does this mean in practice? How are we going to measure this? Do we have a clearly defined objective that we want to reach? That is quite difficult with all these P2Ps. What do you really want to achieve? What is the objective that you set out? So this whole set of impact mechanisms that I showed from these framework programs, that's also very much part of the public partnerships, and the societal challenge element of almost all the bonuses and so forth, make it even more difficult because it adds a long-term dimension. And how are you evaluating a bonus? How has that changed the quality of the environment in the Baltic area? That's going to be a long-term thing, and it's going to be in 10 years from now that you might be seeing some immediate effects. But also the efficiency question. Evaluation, you always ask, was all this programs and so forth, was it done efficiently? And one of the things that we hear a lot, if you go around the scene of the P2Ps, and I heard it yesterday as well, it takes quite a lot of effort. There's a lot of governance involved. There's a lot of sitting together in meetings involved. There's a lot of transaction cost. These partnerships cost a lot of transaction costs. A lot of people have to sit in a lot of meetings. Is it worth it? If you look at it from the perspective of the researchers, what was the added value for them to do this all together with all these stakeholders? Was it efficient enough? And that is a question that I hear from a lot of member states more and more. Isn't this all getting very complex, the governance of it and the amount of human resources we have to spend on public-private partnership? Now, on this question of what objectives did we really want to achieve, I have here just the sort of the change theory of P2Ps. Very simplistically, we say, we coordinate national research agendas, we get co-funding from the Commission, then we are going to align our strategies with the co-funding together. We get more efficient, effective funding for research that allows the best in Europe to collaborate with each other, and we will get improved quality and relevance of research. This alignment will lead to less duplications, larger R&D projects, better use of complementary knowledge in the countries, because we can pool together researchers from different complementary areas, more holistic policy approaches, maybe better use of joint infrastructures. And all this will have an impact on science. And this is usually where we look at science and innovation in a very short term. But it should have an impact on societal challenge and an impact on policy. And better policy then leads to more societal challenge areas. We tried, and this is again very complicated, and I don't expect you to read it. One of the things is, the better you know what you want to achieve, the better you can evaluate it, because then you know where should we look at to see if we've achieved that. And this was what we call a logical framework analysis for the first GPI. This was on the Alzheimer GPI. I think the core messages here is that we spent months discussing with the stakeholders what is it actually that we want to achieve, and that was really difficult already. The discussion in the governance board, what is it that we want to achieve? We came up with, on the top end, policy indicators, and on the bottom end, science, more science-related indicators. So we looked at expected policy impacts, like better, more policies for, say, alleviating Alzheimer issues. We look at, the science outputs are only halfway where you go from objectives to activities, outputs, outcomes, impacts. And it's the expected societal impacts that we in this case, better quality of life, less cases of Alzheimer's disease, and trying to develop indicators and see where the impact was for all these things, but particularly looking at, have we really improved policy making, research programming in this area? So there are some basic bottlenecks. As I said, if you define your objectives very well, you can then look for, if you evaluate, have we achieved it? But as you know, I guess from your own experience with bonus, research programming by collective, by a number of stakeholders, gets a very broad focus and very often fuzzy objectives. I understood from the discussions yesterday you have about 17 objectives, 17 thematic themes. That's quite broad. So evaluating whether you've reached all these 17 is quite difficult. What we see in a lot of countries is that the data, who actually takes part in all these partnerships, isn't really collected centrally. We have what I'll talk a bit more about, mutual learning exercises between countries on public-to-private partnerships. It was clear that one research agency doesn't know about ERA-NETs in another research agency or another ministry. No one has really started mapping the who actually take part, what projects are there in a really good way, and how that aligns with other programs. How it has changed national programming is it's a bit of a black box. Has funding nationally changed because of these international collaboration projects? It's mostly anecdotal evidence. It needs big data collection with this neurodegenerative diseases, this Alzheimer project. We try to map all the research programming, all the research funding that is there in Europe on this topic. And that was a huge exercise. That was a sort of a baseline study, but the difficulty is that many countries, this research is also in institutions. It's not in programs, it's in institutions. How have you changed, have we changed the agendas of these institutions is not easy to say. And I guess the key question is, could we have achieved this by a series of national programs or bilateral programs? The added value of doing in the partnership is still a bit, the key question for the future also. What is the benefit and what is the cost? Does the cost in all this extra governance outweigh the benefits? So the state of play in P2P evaluation, very short, individual initiatives such as bonus, but also other Article 185 like EDCTP have been evaluated. ERANETs have been evaluated, but the numbers are still small and mostly focused on the immediate outputs. At instrument level, yes, there has been evaluations of individual ERANETs and in the also the joint programming. The Article 185, as far as I know, are not sort of looked at as an instrument in general. And there's an ERA-Learn platform that is developing manual and concepts and so forth. So it is really now starting to get a dynamism. Yes, I'll be short about this also in terms of the time. We did a sort of mutual learning exercise, as I said, with 11 countries that looked at their public-to-public activities, and governance is the key issue there. It's a lack of human resources, particularly for small countries, to be involved in everything. But evaluation was also a huge problem because the lack of data. How do you start by evaluating whether this particular cross-country collaboration has brought us more than, say something that would be done only in our national countries. And as a result of this, countries are starting to map more clearly what they are doing. Now, my last slide, as I said, we're getting more and more feedback in countries. Well, it is very complex and time-consuming, this governance. Not only that, there are so many public-to-public instruments that, how do I explain at home with the stakeholders what the difference is between an Article 185 and a GPI and an ERANET and a European Innovation Partnership and a PPP and a flagship FET? There's getting so many of them, and which one do we choose from? And member states are starting, and I think Finland was one of the first to really start saying, well, we need a selection process internally to decide which one are we going to join and which one are we not going to join, because it's getting just too complex. And that makes them think about what is really the added value of joining a P2P. And more countries are starting to think in that in that way. We can't be in everything. We need to really start focusing and see which of these instruments are useful for us. But we also need to think about the governance internally. It's not just changing the instruments. It's not just asking the Commission to be more, focused. It's also how do we deal with that internally in our own governance system, because I think particularly these societal challenges type initiatives have seen how difficult it is to join up, say, ministries of agriculture and science and energy and maritime thing to really work together and define common agendas and define what is really a priority. So I think a very easy first step is starting to mapping and data collection of what you have achieved. I think from the presentations you've already really done a lot on that, and but I think one of the things for the future thinking about FP9 is really to make a better estimation of what are the transaction costs of all these P2Ps, the reporting, the complex governance bodies, because a lot of particularly smaller countries and also bigger countries are suffering with this human resource bottleneck. How can we all be really involved in the strategic decision making if we have to join so many instruments? So I think it's really interesting to work from your bonus experience and to help thinking is how could we do this better in FP9. And yes, I thank you for the attention with this. Thank you.